A devoted husband stages an extravagant rooftop birthday for his wife only to be publicly humiliated when she presents him a gag gift, a t-shirt reading "divorced," while toasting a coworker. He walks out, reclaims his life, channels the pain into self-care, work, running, and anonymous writing. His blog, titled after the 157 missed calls she leaves, resonates with readers and becomes a movement. She implodes professionally and returns begging. He refuses. A year later, he is a speaker abroad, transformed and empowered. Night folded over the city like a velvet sheet. From the rooftop, the skyline cut clean teeth against the dark, glass, and light, and a promise that everything could look perfect if you paid the price. He stood near the edge with a drink gone flat in his hand, listening to laughter that sounded like music from someone else's life. The band played a slow song he could have sworn they'd never agreed on. Paper lanterns swayed above like small moons he'd ordered himself, each one another line item checked off in his head. He carried the evening the way some men carry briefcases, practical, heavy, full of things he wasn't supposed to drop. Orchids in low bowls. A cake that would slice into memory. A champagne tower that would catch the ceiling light and throw it back into everyone's faces. All of it for Maya, for the small laugh she used when she surprised him and the way her hand always found his at the movies. She was the room's sun. When she laughed, people leaned closer as if orbiting her warmth. He watched from where he'd hung back for weeks, fixing misplaced napkins and discreetly nudging a tray into the path of an uncle. He felt proud. Tired, yes, but proud in the way a craftsman feels when the stool he's made finally holds someone. He loved the choreography of this life, the planning, the money, the late nights cutting corners so the next day would look effortless. Then she took the microphone. Her voice cut through the hum. It was light and warm, the kind that made everyone soften. He expected a toast. He expected gratitude that would make the ache of months of work dissolve like sugar in champagne. Instead, she told a story about a man named Damien, a colleague, an anchor, a name he'd heard delivered casually over wine and elevators. She called him my guiding light, the phrase striking like a pebble to glass. He smiled reflexively at first. The room smiled with him, worried for the punchline he assumed lay ahead. She turned toward him slowly, a practiced grin tightening like a trap. "For you," she said, "I got something small." She handed him a paper bag as if it contained sentimental nonsense. He reached in, mind already measuring the weight of the unknown. A shirt folded neat as a secret. He held it up for the table and the letters hit him before the fabric could, white on black, blunt and deliberate, divorced. Sound contracted. A choking laugh moved through the crowd like wind through reeds, unsure where to settle. Heat flooded his neck, his cheeks, and then a calm so cold it was almost surgical spread under the skin. He would not perform in anger for them. He set the bag down. No theatrics. He reached into his pocket instead and rested the bracelet he'd bought on the table beside the cake, a quiet, bright fact, and walked out without looking back. Outside, the evening air did what distance does. It clarified. The rooftop noise dimmed. Shoes on pavement became a metronome for something else in him ticking open. The city flashed rumors of oblivion below. He didn't know where he'd go, only that every step away simplified what had been complicated by performative love. He kept walking until the lamps blurred and his hands stopped trembling. On the other side of that glass wall the party's lights still flickered. In his chest, something irrevocable folded shut. He had given the night to someone who turned him into a joke. The moment was precise and its edges were sharp. He left the bracelet on an empty slice of tablecloth and with it, the idea that sacrifice buys love. Tonight, a different ledger began to be written, one where he wrote only for himself. Morning found him on a borrowed couch, sunlight slashing through blinds and making bars across his face like prison windows he'd chosen to step away from. Theo's apartment smelled like old coffee and slower lives. It was messy in a way that felt honest. He'd collapsed there after the night, shoes still scuffed, suit creased like a flag abandoned in haste. For a while they passed days as if none of them were mine. Theo left bowls by the door, made little coffee rituals, offered fewer questions than expected. Sometimes silence could be the kindest thing. Memory unspools slowly in the light. He traced back through the years, the moves he'd made for her, the promotions he'd let go because her schedule didn't accommodate his new title, the vacations rearranged to fit her flights. He remembered the small things too, how she tucked stray hair behind an ear when she was nervous, how she used the word "we" to make decisions feel mutual. Those memories built the scaffolding for his confusion. Why had he always been the steady surface she could push things onto? Theo slid a mug into his hand and said what friends always say when a bridge burns slowly and then collapses: "You don't come back from something like that." It wasn't cruel, it was a map. He didn't argue. He'd already felt the finality of the rooftop in bone and letter. The bracelet in his pocket felt heavy with possession and denial. He let it sit there like a relic of an old life. He called a lawyer because indignity required paperwork to translate into freedom. Clara's office smelled like pressed suits and caffeine. She measured him with a glance that had no time for melodrama. Clean and quiet, he told her, because he wanted the divorce to be an eraser, not an intermission. She drew lines, circled items, and in gentle businesslike strokes, she gave a name to the thing that had been unnamed: closure by agreement. Back in his apartment, finally his, but not yet home, he changed things with small domestic violence. He tossed the throw pillows he'd tolerated for years. He pulled down photographs where his face seemed half present. He made a corner for himself, a thrifted desk, a lamp, a stack of notebooks. The gestures were small and stubbornly practical. He started running at dawn because motion had a way of wearing down the thorns lodged in memory. Miles scraped away his thinking into something usable. Work became a scaffold to rebuild on. Gregory, a man who measured worth by deadlines and outcomes, handed him a nightmare client and a chance that felt like a compliment. He leaned into spreadsheets and timelines the way a drowning man clutches a plank. Late nights turned into early mornings into plans. He helped a couple of young founders, messy, hopeful, and hungry, and the work became less about impressing someone else and more about creating evidence that he could make things last. He invested, advised, and watched small things grow because tending is a form of prayer. At night he wrote, first to himself, then to the dark web of strangers. Words that started as a confession about a single evening, the T-shirt, the walkout, the 157 unanswered calls, became a post. He hit publish with no expectation and then forgot it. Replies came like low silt shifting in a riverbed, one mail, then a handful, then scores of comments that read like faces in a crowd saying, "Me too." The anonymity of strangers turned private grief into a chorus. It didn't happen overnight. His writing didn't explode, it accrued. There were nights of few reads, mornings when he deleted drafts and rewrote, afternoons when he crawled back to the couch and considered picking up the phone to answer her. The choice to keep it down, to let the messages pile as unread artifacts, was discipline. He learned to honor small rituals, runs, client calls, the ritual of brewing coffee before the world fully woke. Each tiny repetition soldered him into someone who could stay put without collapsing into old patterns of forgiveness for performance. And as the body healed in repetition, the idea of movement grew teeth. The blog became a ledger of survival. Readers began to reach back with questions and thanks. He realized that a wound, if tended, could become a map for others. That realization would change what he did next, but for now it was simply an ember, small, warm, and stubbornly alive. One gray morning a message arrived that made his chest click like a door suddenly closing. Damien had resigned. It sounded like a footnote, an internal HR flip, but to him it read like an erasure of a man who'd been the axis of his ex's universe. Rumors spread the same way fog does, soft and insistive. Damien's exit left her unmoored. Without that reflective light, her polish dimmed. People who used to orbit her started looking elsewhere. He didn't gloat. He simply felt the world's weight shift a few degrees toward equilibrium. The bruise in his chest had a curious aftertaste, relief and the hollow note of emptiness. He had spent months turning inward, layering habits over the rawness. Then, without drama, life served a quiet twist. Her misstep was not his triumph, it was the unmaking of the stage she'd built and, in that tumble, she looked small. The chorus of messages from mutual friends confirmed it. Podcasts sinking, PR misfires, social posts flagged and tattered. He thumbed through them without celebration. Curiosity was a bland thing. That same week, a young startup reached out for help. Sasha and Omar wanted structure. They wanted someone to hold timelines and dreams until they grew teeth. He began to meet them at a corner diner that smelled of fry oil and possibility. They were chaotic and earnest, full of ideas and low on execution. He became the man who could make their scatter into lists, and their gratitude reminded him who he was when not being another person's shadow. Meanwhile, the blog's rhythm deepened. What began as a one-off post turned into a habit. He wrote about mundane salvations, the shape of new routines, the sting, and then the relief of the first unpaid night, the small victories that weren't visible to the public. Comments arrived like a tide, people with stories of their own standing-up moments, readers who printed his words and taped them above bathroom mirrors. The audience grew because vulnerability resonates, not for its scandal, but for the recognition it offers. He felt the odd, private satisfaction of being read honestly. Yet fame, small as it was, brought its own tests. He received an invitation to speak at a local seminar. He laughed at the notion until the email repeated itself in his inbox with an attached agenda. "Your name keeps coming up," it said. He imagined an auditorium half full, then rehearsed what he would say, how to translate loss into structure, how to make a life whose axis was not someone else. The idea of standing and telling strangers about being humiliated in public made his palms slick. But when the night came, the applause warmed him in an entirely different way than the rooftop ever had. The midpoint arrived not with fireworks, but with a quiet decision to own the story rather than let it own him. There were setbacks, a negative comment that stabbed, a night where he almost reopened his phone to answer her, but these were interludes, not endings. His friends saw it. Theo saw it in the way he smiled, less strained and more sure. Sasha and Omar saw it in lists and timelines that finally stuck. And then, anonymously at first, people began to repurpose his phrases. Someone printed a shirt with a different word on it, not a bitter reclamation but a claim. The first prototype read "Rebuilt." He laughed when he saw a photo. It was crude, home-printed on a kitchen press, but it felt less like appropriation and more like a flag. The movement, small, human, messy, had a rough center, people showing up to say they were done being props. The twist was this: the humiliation that had been intended to break him instead became the hinge. Not because he wanted attention, but because he chose language over reaction, structure over spectacle. Where once his identity had formed around appeasing someone else, now it formed around creating things that lasted. The choice to speak, to transform private pain into public instruction, changed the problem. It didn't make the night stop hurting, but it turned the hurt into coal for something that could burn steadily. Growth is a patient thing. It rarely announces itself. Weeks blurred into months of small, stubborn labor. Dawn runs kept him honest, miles counted, breath regulated, each footfall a little act of reclamation. Work expanded. The nightmare client became a case study. Sasha and Omar's app launched in a shaky beta and then, staggeringly, found traction in pockets that mattered. He put money where faith had been and watched the numbers climb, not spectacularly, but enough to set the gears turning. His writing deepened too. He stopped using the blog as therapy alone and began shaping lessons: how to set boundaries, how to reinvest in oneself, how to detect performance love. Each post read less like a relay of pain and more like a manual for repair. Readers responded with gratitude and with their own stories, emails that smelled of late nights and typed-out courage. He answered back, not always, but enough to build a thread of human reciprocity. The circle widened. Yet the pressure points remained. She existed in the backdrop like a pending weather system. News of her public stumbles trickled in, failed episodes, a PR flap, a resignation that left her untethered. Her name surfaced in gossip texts he tried not to read. He felt no glee, only an odd quiet that acceptance sometimes brings. The city he moved through every day no longer turned for her. It kept going, which was the point. Then she came back, but not yet. First came a letter. Handwritten, looping script, page after page of apology and memory. He read it in one sitting, the rain outside tattooing the window. For the first time, the letter did something unexpected. It unsettled him. Not because it stirred love, but because it demanded appraisal. Did it change anything? No. But it forced him to consider whether the story had room for re-entry. He slid the pages into a drawer that night, not to hide them, but to keep them honest. A knock came in the rain a few weeks later. She stood on his threshold, soaked and small, mascara streaked, asking if she could come in. The sight of her, ordinary and vulnerable, made the air in the room tilting. It was a test of the new architecture he'd built. She needed something. The old him might have housed the plea. But the man who answered that night had learned to hear his own pulse before others. He let her step inside, watched her tremble on his couch, and felt the old instinct to console flicker. Instead, he listened. Her apology contained inventory and regret, an admission of selfishness, a catalogue of debts owed to him. "I miss you," she said, voice small. He had done the math in his head, night by night, mile by mile. He had rebuilt the scaffolding of his life. Her plea did not align with the ledger he kept. "No," he said quietly. It landed like a verdict because it was not cruel but clean. She had used people as props. He refused to be one more set piece in her attempt to reassemble her public image. She wept, the rain at the window echoing her sound. He stayed upright, not to punish, but because standing was now the only honest posture. She rose and left without looking back, disappearing into the storm. He locked the door and did not follow her. The choice was made. It would have been easy to return to the pattern, easier still to let guilt shepherd him back. But the new life he'd constructed required a cost, refusing to be the safety net for someone who'd weaponized him for applause. The climax didn't erupt like a cinematic masterpiece. It arrived in the hush after the door closed, the stillness that follows a decision. He sat down, picked up the guitar he'd started playing again, and let sound fill the room. The music was simple and true. It did not erase the past, but it outlined the next chapter. In that quiet, he understood what the blog had been pointing toward, transformation that required both loss and labor. The stage was set. The first time he spoke to a crowd about the thing that had nearly broken him, he thought his voice would fracture. Instead, it came steady and tempered by the miles he'd run alone. The seminar was modest, a local hall, folding chairs, a handful of journalists. But his words landed in ways he hadn't anticipated. They stuck like glue where something had been slid loose. The audience clapped, and their faces were not for spectacle but for recognition. One woman in the front row cried openly. A man in the back nodded until his chin lifted as if he'd been holding his breath. Then the invitations multiplied. Small stages, podcasts, a magazine piece, and finally an email that felt impossible, an offer to speak at an international forum in Milan. He almost turned it down because the old part of him still feared the spotlight that used to be someone else's. But this time the light would be on work he'd built, not on service rendered to another's image. He took it. The Milan stage was black and enormous, lights arced like distant comets. Backstage his heart beat a soft percussion and then steadied. He stepped into a hall of faces the way a man steps into the ocean, aware of the breath, unsure of its depth. He began with a memory and did not flinch. He described the rooftop, the shirt, the way silence compressed the room. He did not cast blame like a weapon. Instead, he laid out the arithmetic of reclaiming himself: runs, coffee, clients, late-night drafts that turned into a blog, then a community. Midway through his talk, he did something that surprised even him. He took off his jacket and, in his hand, held a simple black shirt printed in white letters, "Rebuilt." A murmur rolled through the room, not mockery, not derision, but recognition in a different register. He wore it for a beat, then tossed it to the edge of the stage and continued talking about the slow work of repair. The shirt became a prop that flipped the script. What once had been a tool of humiliation became an emblem of return. Questions afterward were many. Someone asked how he'd resisted answering the phone the night after the party. He told the truth, that not answering had been an act of preservation, not vengeance. Another asked whether forgiveness ever returned. He answered that forgiveness exists, but not at the expense of one's own integrity. Each answer tightened the arc of his transformation into a set of teachable practices rather than mere catharsis. When the applause came, it was not the same applause that had cheered her party. This clapping had weight. People were applauding a man who had repurposed pain into pathwork. Backstage, journalists and strangers queued with requests, a podcast, a feature, a collaboration. He felt the old hunger to be noticed, but this time it was redirected. He agreed to the interviews with a new clarity about purpose. Later that night in a hotel room, he scrolled through messages that had begun to arrive during the day, emails from readers he'd never met, testimonies from strangers who had used his words as scaffolding to pick up their own lives. One message stood out, brief and shaky. "I quit tonight," it read. "Your post gave me the courage." He set the phone down and felt something strange. The bruised part of him was no longer the center of gravity. He had become conduit, not cause. The climax was not an explosion, but a confluence. The day he claimed the stage, the moment a small idea turned into a movement, the hour when private sorrow found architecture to become public aid. He had taken back what had been taken and then multiplied it, turning loss into a shared tool. The victory was not over her. It was over the old agreement he had with himself that his worth was conditional on being someone else's support. He had walked through the door and, on the other side, found that the room was large enough for others to follow. Time thins the edges of events until only the decisive moments remain sharp. A year after the rooftop, he sat in a green room in Milan watching his talk stream to an auditorium somewhere else, replies pinging from corners of the world he hadn't seen on a map. Invitations kept coming, Dubai, then a podcast, and yet the thing that surprised him most was how small the bracelet in his drawer now felt. It existed in a different ledger. Once an emblem of disappointment, it was now an artifact of a life he'd reclaimed and catalogued. The movement he'd not intended grew because the experience behind it was not unique, it was human. People sent photos of their own shirts with slogans they'd chosen, small, quiet declarations. The name Rebuilt became less about merch and more about permission to finally stop playing parts for people who never asked to share their stage. He met readers who had left jobs, started projects, set boundaries where they'd previously said yes. They told him his words had been a small ember in a larger act of courage. He replied that bravery often smells like mundane routine. He thought about the night she returned in the rain, the door he'd closed, the way silence had felt like a chosen friend. He'd not sought revenge. There had been no spectacle. When he read the letter she'd left, he'd felt the odd ache of missed timing. She had reached him too late. The marriage had been dissolved not by hissed words, but by a long erosion of visibility. He bore no public hatred for her, only a firm boundary born from survival. At times people asked whether he forgave. Forgiveness, he said in interviews, was a private currency. It was granted when the grantor had fully reclaimed their own life, not as repayment to another. He had reached that side by building a rhythm that began with small, stubborn acts, runs at dawn, a desk lamp that became an altar to ideas, weekly calls with founders who needed his steadiness. Those rituals had outlived pain. One evening, months after Milan, he received a message from Theo. "You ever think about going back?" He sipped his coffee and laughed softly. There was a nostalgia in the question, but not an appeal. Going back, he learned, would mean trading the future for a rehearsed version of comfort. He typed no. Forward only. It was the simplest, truest sentence he could send. His life had become a collection of small stages, workshops, guest posts, late-night playlists shared with strangers. The bracelet remained in a drawer beside a letter. Sometimes he opened it to look at the way light caught the metal and remembered how cold the rooftop air had been the night he walked away. Memory lost its power when it was turned into witness rather than instruction. He could recall that moment without flinching now. It had done its job. On his final night before flying to another city for a talk, he walked the neighborhood streets with a guitar slung across his back. He played on Theo's rooftop for a small group of friends, the city breathing around them in 1,000 lights. Someone passed a printed shirt around the small circle, black, white letters, Rebuilt. No one made a spectacle of it. They wore it like an inside truth. When he packed for the airport the next morning, he tucked the bracelet into its place and zipped his bag. He stood at the window for a long time looking out at the city he'd left and rebuilt inside himself. The horizon wasn't a line anymore, but a promise. He had answered one important call that night long ago, the one he placed to himself when he stepped away. The rest of the calls, the ones that used to dictate his heartbeat, had been sent to voicemail and allowed to collect dust. He lowered himself into the taxi, phone silenced by habit now rather than necessity. The driver asked where to. He gave the airport and then added, almost as an afterthought, next stop, another chance. The city receded behind the windows, and he smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had learned how to keep walking.